Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. We're super excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us. I'm just a guest host. My name is Stefan Van Divendijk. I'm the accounting operations evangelist here at Flowcast. My background's been in accounting my entire career up until this role. Two-time corporate controller, worked in public accounting, KPMG for a number of years. And I'm really excited, actually, for our guest to join us today. We have Razak Jallow, our Flowcast CFO. Razak, how about you give us a quick introduction here?
Hey, thanks for having me on again. Razak Jallow, CFO of Flowcast. I've been finance my whole career, mostly in the tech space, obviously here at Flowcast, but before that, leading finance teams at Google, Adobe, and Apple.
Awesome. Thanks, Razak. And just so everybody knows, it's, Razak's working at a company that's predominantly accountants, and it's really hard to have a finance background in a building full of accountants. We're always picking and nitpicking at everything that finance people have to say. So for him to be successful in this role just shows how good he is at his job. Our other guest is Chris Hennessy. Believe me, I am not. This guy's a legend. Our other guest is Chris Hennessy, AWS Enterprise Strategist and former technology CFO at Capital One. Chris, welcome on board. Give us a quick introduction.
Yeah, Stefan, such a pleasure to be here with you and Razak. As mentioned, I've been with AWS for about 3 years. I'm in a role where I engage with CFOs across the globe around technology transformation and spent over 20 years at Capital One, all within finance as well, just like Razak. But spent 10 years as the technology CFO there, driving through a digital transformation, not only for the organization, but also within finance. So I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. And we love having you. Thank you so much for joining us. And as Chris was kind of hinting at, our conversation, our topic today is over our financial transformation ebook and financial transformation in general. And so we thought it'd be really helpful to have two CFOs with us on this call, get the CFO's perspective. We try to do that a lot here on Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets, but when I'm writing content here at Flowcast or when we're presenting a lot of stuff, we're generally speaking to the controller, and it's, that's the persona we're speaking to. It's the lens we're kind of looking at from things. But I think it's really good to know what the CFO's role in this is, what their viewpoint is. And, if you're a CFO listening to this, I think it'll be a lot more useful to you. But if you're a controller or an accounting manager listening to this, I think you're going to have a lot of insights into what your boss is looking for and what they need from you and how to be a really good support to them. So with that, I actually want to kick off the topic with a little bit of Chris's background, especially around a technology CFO at Capital One. I think that's a super interesting role. I've seen it maybe once or twice in my career, but I've never really had a chance to talk about what that means in an organization. So could you give us a quick rundown of a technology CFO, Chris?
Yeah, I think as you all know, most finance organizations are broken into main components. There's obviously an accounting or controllership function. There's also financial planning and analysis, and many will have treasury or investor relations or other teams supporting it as well. So within financial planning and analysis, most organizations may not have a technology CFO, depending on the size of their IT or technology organization, but there's usually somebody within financial planning and analysis supporting them. And it's a traditional support role you would expect. How do you deploy capital and make investment choices within that? How do you measure the value that's being generated by those investments? You tend to have partners who are the CIOs or divisional CIOs, so you're supporting them, but you're also facing off with the business leaders and product leaders because many of them want to understand what value they're getting from all the technology investments that are being made. So it was a great role. I loved the role, not only being kind of an advocate within finance around how technology could transform how you operate, but also supporting people outside of finance who don't know a lot about finance, especially CIOs or CTOs who lean heavily on their finance team. So it was a great blend of having technical skills, but also the ability to dive deep on the analytics side. But you also have to partner with accounting a lot, anywhere from software capitalization to other accounting policy decisions that need to be made. These are really critical, but as you all know, both know, yeah, you have to have the really unique skills to be really good at those jobs. So I was very happy to lean on them on a lot of the specific accounting technical details because I just didn't have that knowledge and perspective. So it was an incredible company, incredible role, but I'm very excited from a scaled standpoint that I can engage with customers across the globe. And I work with a lot of technology CFOs and corporate CFOs now and really help them help drive both transformation and influence their company strategy.
I just want to say I'm really excited about Chris's background. Like we talk a lot on these CFO podcasts about how business models are getting more long range, more complicated, more harder to understand. And I think the technology investments for digital transformation are doing exactly that. And so I'm really excited to learn from Chris and his experiences on this podcast.
Definitely. And I think what's wonderful about this is, Razak has also led and been a part of in his past life in Adobe is, taking a company from a, point of sale almost kind of model to, hey, let's get them on subscription and transition that value and that payment plan. And I think a lot of us forget like the time before subscription, right? Like we're so busy chasing after subscription and subscription value these days. But Razak was one of the people that actually helped Adobe transfer into that new model. So we got two heavy hitters on the podcast today. So I'm actually going to do very little talking, which is lovely. But I want to prime this conversation with just a little bit of like market stats here. And these are a little bit dated, but I think it's mainly because nothing's come out in 2024 yet on this. But the spending of digital transformation was supposed to reach a staggering like $6.8 trillion in 2023. I don't know where that landed. I don't know what they anticipate in 2024, but based off the fact that most CFOs in 2023 were planning to increase their investment in fintech. And in 2024, 58% of those CFOs say they will increase their time spent on technology investment, and have the second straight quarter of increased investment in fintech. There's a lot of momentum in the marketplace about transformation, whether that's within finance and financial transformation, or whether that's a broader transformation for the organization. And it just goes to show, I guess, that people are marching towards this, right? So I think the first thing I want to get into was, a little bit of an icebreaker. I think, Chris, you have a lot of background in this. Do you have any kind of like story that kind of relates to why you're excited about this topic?
Yeah, I think most of us who get into either an accounting or finance job, one of the reasons why, one, they like the numeric and analytical elements of their job. But two, obviously driving change in an organization typically requires a lot of culture and people influence as well. I know I was reading some studies and surveys recently from both Gartner and Deloitte that called out two of the big barriers for transformation within finance are resistance to change and insufficient skills and resources. And I know one of the reasons I was drawn into finance, and especially why I love the roles within an FP&A function in finance, is you can really help organizations influence in those two barriers. One, the resistance to change. I know there's a lot of side jokes that depending on what job type you're in, an engineering job or an accounting job, you have a certain persona or personality. And some are more resistant to change than other. But I believe at its core, most of us who follow this profession, we want to drive high level of accuracy, high level of quality of information, but also do it in a way that is transformational and insightful for our company. So I've been personally really excited, not only in my prior job, but currently, of seeing kind of tens or hundreds of finance leaders really be able to break through those barriers and drive change. Sometimes they need help and outside counsel, and that's where leaning on partners goes a long way. But really finding ways to drive through the tough choices that need to be made. A lot of time I spend with customers is helping to figure out a framework to think about making those choices. So how do you put a lens on making, because as you know, we're all kind of fixed capacity or somewhat have to work with the resources we have. So you've got to make tough prioritization choices that exist inside of your company. And a lot of finance and accounting leaders can help do that because they're one of the few orgs in the company that don't have a deep functional bias around what they're trying to do. They tend to be smaller teams, but mighty teams who can help drive the right outcomes for their shareholders or their stakeholders or the customers. Where a lot of people, if you're in marketing, sales, or other orgs, you have certain kind of functional bias inside of the organization. So that's one of the reasons why I chose to be within the finance realm. And specifically, as you think about framing out the transformation story, I think we're uniquely positioned to be able to transform even after we just get through some of those barriers I mentioned on the front end.
Yeah, I think that, when I look at my career and I think anecdotally a lot of us have the same story we get into accounting, we get into finance because we do like to support others and help them make informed decisions and have the information in front of them. And I think that a lot of us, we do have that bias. I've moved into a marketing role, and it's very interesting to have that transition of seeing from the accounting lens into the marketing lens, a little bit into the sales lens. And you realize how important it is to translate what is actually happening across the organization. And that's something that we've seen internally at Flowcast. Razak onboards new people by like helping them understand our different metrics as a SaaS company and helping them kind of like break down some of those biases, some of those informational silos. But that's how we transform an organization. You actually teed us up really well for the first topic I want to talk about from the ebook, which was awareness and familiarity with transformation. Our study found that CFOs claim to be about 2.2 times more familiar with different types of financial transformation than their accounting teams. And I think at face value, that makes a lot of sense, right? You don't get to be a CFO without years of experience and develop judgment. You see a lot. So hopefully you would be more familiar with financial transformation. At the same time, both CFOs and their teams claim to have a fair amount of familiarity with something called visceral transformation. So this was kind of baited in the study. Visceral transformation is not a real thing, at least as far as any of us were aware. And it's a made up term. So it's there to find out how much people really know. It's essentially there as like a baseline or a benchmark to say two things. One, are people just saying that they know transformation to say they know transformation? And two, you can actually adjust your familiarity score based off how many people are claiming that they understand visceral transformation. So if you have 10% of the population roughly claiming that, then you can X out those number of people in the population from knowing anything about the other transformation. So it's a neat little thing. What I find interesting about this is, to me, it suggests that there's a pressure on the CFO to create belief in their ability around transformation. There's a lot of pressure in the role to be that transformation lead, to be that transformation, knowledge house. And to your point, Chris, it sounds like you have a lot of conversations with people about maybe not knowing what the frameworks are or how to make those decisions. So with that, I'm actually going to open up to Razak. How have you dealt with that in your career? Like when you're faced with these kind of pressures on whether it's financial transformation or broader entity transformation, how do you deal with this pressure of having to know everything, Razak?
I love this. I'm going to resist the urge to mock all of us CFOs for claiming we know what visceral transformation is. I think it's a good reality check, and certainly inexcusable for us to be saying that, but maybe I'll provide some context around why I think that happens. I absolutely love this question and how it came back. CFO leaders, and I actually think this is true for all leaders in an organization. It's not unique to CFOs, but you have to inspire the people to the team to do their best. And the team has to believe that they have a leader that knows the direction they're going. And at the same time, you also have to make a lot of decisions with either incomplete or imperfect or flawed information. And so you combine all that together, and there's actually a lot of decisions that are directionally correct, but maybe not have full visibility into how it's going to get done. You're going to get there, not quite sure of all the details. And unfortunately, it sounds like sometimes that leads to overstating and pretending that we know things we don't know. I'd like to think I don't do that very much. But I think it goes to the core issue is that anytime you embark on a transformation project, the CFO is in a unique position because it's the one role in the company that actually gets to go in and poke at everything and is familiar with everything because everything hits the P&L. They're not an expert in everything, but they're familiar with everything. And so the CFO is going to have to make a decision on a transformation project with incomplete data, probably just a little bit of research and hoping that you figure out the rest of the things along the way. And so that leads to sometimes having overconfidence in what you know and what you can decide. But it also really is kind of part of the job in terms of making decisions with incomplete information. Because if you knew every single step you had to make through the transformation, you've probably already paid for the entire transformation. You'll learn along the way a little bit.
Yeah, I love that perspective where, you do have to put up, this image that you do know everything, or that you're at least capable of getting people through there. And I think you made a good distinction there where you have to show people that you're capable, but you don't necessarily need to claim that you know everything, right? It's helping people understand that you have the experience and the judgment to make the decisions in the dark where necessary and get you going in the right direction. But part of the process is figuring out some of the pains along the way. I don't think anybody has a really clear understanding of what the transformation is, to your last point there, which is you're always going to find out some nuance in some department of some decision making that you had no idea and no one really knew about because it was tribal knowledge along the way that will change perhaps a little bit of the direction you're going, but in substance didn't change the overall direction of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think as people get farther along in their career and they see more and more of organizations at different sizes and different teams, you might know a little bit more, but you learn a lot less in aggregate. And so you just find the right people to talk to figure out the right solutions. But the broader scope you have and the things you see, the actually more you realize how much you don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. And for, sorry, I was just going to say really quick is for controllers that are listening, realize like that's what your CFO is doing. They're trying to directionally get you in the right direction and make those big decisions. And I think your role as a controller accounting manager is to help them fine tune the ship along the way. So keep those channels of communication open and realize that's like kind of what your supporting role is. Chris, you have these conversations every day in your role as an executive strategist. How are you handling this with CFOs that are coming to you with questions?
Yeah, I think I love what Razak shared. And I think one thing I notice is I really asked questions to learn about what incentive structures exist inside of organizations. Because if you think about accountants versus CFOs, predominantly outside of regulators, most of the controllers' customers are inside the walls of the company. Obviously, regulators are there as well. For CFOs, and depending on your ownership structure, sometimes you have even more external kind of constituents and customers that are outside of it. So I think thinking through kind of where's their pressure being applied, what are some of the needs to transform for CFOs? They may feel some more of that external pressure in the need to transform, either relative to others or relative to expectations from either analysts, stakeholders, or shareholders. What Razak mentioned is spot on. Sometimes you need to have that broader perspective. I know one of the things I talk to customers a lot, and this accountants may not like this, so I'll share it now though, but is explainability matters more than accuracy, especially for a CFO talking about and being able to storytell what's happening either inside or outside the company is really critical. Obviously, accuracy of financials, that's the controller job and job one for all. But as you get into the element of directional or guidance or a range of outcomes, those are the ways CFOs talk because you're never going to have the level of accuracy, especially when you talk about forward-looking estimates or forecasts or things like that, which is a world CFOs live in a lot, which is trying to predict the future and then guide and influence decisions in that way. So that was something that came to mind when you shared the results of the survey.
I love that. I love the perspective of, there's a lot of other external stakeholders that put pressures on the CFO around transformation that we probably don't have insight into as controllers or accounting managers. Maybe we're hearing about one or two, but a great place to take a conversation with your CFO if you're thinking about going through a transformation process is understanding where their pressure's at and what their ask is more innately than just saying, well, I think maybe investors care a little bit, or how are they tying that back to company mission and vision? Internally, a lot of times we just make the decision to say, well, clearly that would be beneficial to us. Therefore we should do it. It's very black and white. There's not a deeper understanding from the controller's perspective into, well, you actually have to sell that to the investors or to the board on why you're going to maybe shift budget or change budget to go after a new transformation process. You have to link it back to some ROI to the greater good of the organization versus saying, well, clearly it's better visibly, so why would I have to look at it deeper? So I think that's a really good perspective. And I like the other aspect, because this is something that I think accountants really struggle with. I agree with you on this, Chris. I know I struggle with this is, we really like to be precise in our numbers and have accurate financials. However, that's really just meant to be a baseline to help you tell the story of the past. But looking in the future, like that's just an outline, right? Like that's not a robust story. That's an outline of what you think is going to happen. Then operationally you execute against that and then you write the story afterwards. But you're just writing a draft of the future. So you can't be overly precise with it. You're just trying to get the message across of like what the actual goal is. So great things I think for listeners to think about is those external parties and, what you're actually trying to communicate to people going forward. The other thing that I thought was interesting in the study when we think about awareness and familiarity is we find that as a company moves to a larger and more complex stage from startup to public, CFO familiarity diverges with their teams in that kind of scaling to IPO range. CFOs have a lot more understanding of transformation than their accounting teams. But then when we get to public, accounting teams kind of keep climbing and CFOs take a dive and they kind of meet up and converge against for a public company. There's perhaps a lot of different ways to look at this, but Razak, as you are the CFO for a scaling pre-IPO company, and you look at transformation, have you found that there's this large difference there in this stage of company, but then when you're more of a public entity like you were at Adobe and Looker after they're acquired by Google, it kind of just evens out? What's your perspective here?
I think there's a lot of factors to it. I also think, once you're a large public company, you've gone through a lot of digital transformation already. It's never something that ends. It's not like, oh, we're done with digital transformation, I never have to modernize any of my processes ever again. That's not a real thing. But people have been through a few before, and it's not hard for them to project out like what the future will be. And I think especially in fast growing companies, not used to that. Right. And you think about the fast growing smaller companies, they're scaling in a lot of different ways. One example would be you might have one accountant that had 10 different steps in a workflow that he or she owned. And so if you want to improve that workflow, that accountant knows the workflow start to finish. As you scale and you get bigger, now maybe you've got more specialization, more complexity, communication gets harder. Instead of that accountant having 10 different parts of that workflow, now you've got 5 different accountants that just own one part of that workflow. And to actually figure out the whole workflow, now you've got to talk to several different teams. And as specialization comes, you get a higher narrowness of vision. And I think that's one of the reasons that the CFO kind of stays the same throughout, because they have the whole company vision throughout any stage, right? Whereas their team might have gotten bigger and more specialized, they kind of stayed the same. I think the other piece that's really hard on is timelines on these projects extend as there's more complexity and more people involved, and more people to communicate with. And so instead of a project that might take 3 months at a small company could take a very, very long time at a large company. And so all those things kind of contribute to the big separation as you approach IPO. And then once every company's been through a few digital transformations, the team feels more familiar with it. They've got established processes to handle digital transformation. And so it's not that unknown or scary for people on the other side of IPO. And I'm not sure it's purely IPO. Let's just talk more scale there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good perspective where it's, you definitely, as you become public, it's a lot broader of an organization. It's a lot more complex. And so the fog of war is thicker, right? And more widespread. And I really like the idea of, as you kind of scale as an organization, your team is going to learn a lot. And that's why they're catching up to the CFO so rapidly, as they've had to go through that and they're building their work experience versus the CFO that already has that work experience. And so it kind of makes sense. Eventually there will be some kind of convergence between the teams. Something that when you and I had this conversation previously too, that you had mentioned that I want to draw, because I thought this was an excellent point, is on scalability. There's no real future past being a public company. There's not like another stage past being a public company. So once you get there, it's not like you have the shining example of this next stage that you need to chase after. Whereas you right now are working towards the aspirations of being public. You kind of have a clear North Star for you to execute against, which was a great point that you and I had in passing that I wanted to share as well. To kind of take that to another areas, and I think, again, this one makes sense at face value, but I think we can dive deeper into it, is we find as companies grow larger, the familiarity CFOs have and their teams just diverges and it doesn't converge again. So as you go from 200 people to 500 to 1,000 to 5,000, it just keeps getting wider and wider. Chris, you've worked at a large enterprise at Capital One. You're the technology CFO. how did you deal with this, staggering difference in familiarity of financial transformation between the leadership and the people that maybe need to execute it at more of a tactical level?
I've never had the privilege, as Razak mentioned, of going from to IPO. I entered into a company that was public, but I think I love the themes there, which is you need to evolve kind of your leadership practices as a CFO and the way in which you go through this. And it's a tough transition. I think I know for me, most CFOs and controllers, obviously, typically there's a traditional path, which is growing up through the ranks. So you kind of gain empathy because of how you did things, but obviously as time passes and as technology evolves, how you solve problems is totally different. So a couple of ways to combat it and pieces of advice from my vantage point. One, there's this notion, I loved what Razak mentioned in terms of communication and transparency. How do you create open dialogue? You could think of like a voice of the customer dynamic or doing side by sides, kind of understanding what's the process you go through? What are the challenges? And where could we potentially do things differently to help? A lot of this is around retaining and attracting great talent, but also making sure that you have the knowledge to represent the team and you're building that rapport within that. So I think that's one. Two is this notion of never being over. I totally agree with Razak, especially around education and awareness. I think that's really key to understanding. And you could do maybe as a CFO or controller, how do you get demos of things or really dive deep into new technical things? I know we're probably going to talk about it later, but Gen AI comes up a lot in my customer engagements, especially in finance. And most companies are trying to see what are the use cases we can apply to how we do work. And there's not a ton of people that know a lot about this, but those who tend to be more grassroots are people who just dive in, learn how to use the technology, begin to apply it. So getting educated and becoming aware of things is key. I also did one thing back in my last job that worked really well. A lot of us will talk about or be mentors for people to give career coaching or guidance for individuals. But I've seen some companies leverage reverse mentoring as a way to combat this issue. So what you do is pair up a junior accountant or junior financial analyst with a senior, controller or CFO, and have them create a learning agenda to reverse mentor, to have them understand the way in which work gets done, how to leverage technology, how to deal with the dynamics of generational differences around how you view work in general. And I know we could all have some fun with that in our own personal stories. But I think creating experiences to increase empathy goes a long way to combating some of the issues and challenges you've had of this divergence between teams and CFOs or the controllers and their organizations as well.
Yeah, and I think I really like what you had to say there, Chris. You had a lot of good points, leading on to what Razak was saying about communication and transparency, continuous education. That's something we really believe here at Flowcast. We launched a tool called Flowcademy because we believe so much in continuous education for people and giving them options to learn. But I really love the idea of founding it or having that North Star kind of based in empathy, right? To understanding the person across from you, understanding what their needs are, what their concerns are, or what they would really qualify as like a win or a goal line of some nature. So, because that's something I don't think a lot of us consciously realize is what you're really trying to achieve is empathy with the person that you're working with. So make sure you kind of have a foundation of understanding that, hey, you're trying to work better with these individuals, have empathy for them. Don't lose sight of that. I think back to my public accounting days when, you're grinding through an audit and the partner rolls in, just for dinner on the job. And it's like, oh yeah, you guys are working hard. Yeah, I did this back in my day. Look at me now. And you're like, yeah, accounting was a lot easier back when you did it, man. Like it is drastically different industry. You guys were allowed to have circular references. You probably weren't doing half of this in Excel. And there's a loss of empathy there, right? And it makes people frustrated versus not losing sight as a leader for what your team is going through and understanding that, or even finding times, like you said, to, as best you can as a leader, to stay up to date on what that technology is. Maybe you're not going to know the ins and outs of it. That's probably impossible, but at least having a pulse on maybe what's out there and identifying those champions on your team that can help you stay up to date on it, right? So working with them and saying, okay, what is out there? So all wonderful points, I think, when we look at that divergence as your company grows on how to stay grounded as best you can. The other area that we really talked about in this study was recognition. So, um, how do CFOs recognize the goals of financial transformation? What does it do for the organization? What do accountants view that as? And our study found that technology's usefulness to the user is far more important than its function. That's in another study that we did. And in this study, we find that accountants have a superior vision or visibility into the reality of the needs for transformation than their CFO counterpart, or at least that's what it kind of looks like on face value. So when we compare it and we say, okay, if we ask an accountant, do you have enough visibility into data? The accountants are saying, no, I need more visibility into the data. And CFOs are saying, no, I think we're kind of good on data. And there's a divergence there. And we ask them over a series of questions. And so it points out that the accountant seems to think there's an issue there much more acutely than the CFO does. So one way to take this is that the accountant has more visibility, or perhaps maybe the accountant doesn't have the same perception as the CFO. So I'm going to open this one back up to you, Razak. When you look at perspective of, data issues or whatever it is in your organization, do you find that there's a divergence between you and your team in perception or concern?
That's a great question. I certainly think there's divergence across everyone because everybody's got their unique perspective on the organization, right? We've talked a little about visibility and transparency. My day-to-day probably doesn't take me into the day-to-day of the senior accountant at the same time. And conversely, the day-to-day of the senior accountant probably isn't seeing some of the operational and digital and data issues that span across sales, customer success before they even get to the finance and accounting teams. And so I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's why communication and expertise is so important. So we had a great conversation a couple months ago at Gartner's CFO conference. And I think one of the interesting things that really came out of that for myself and learning was how important people with digital transformation experience were going to be in the accounting profession going forward. And so when you think about like what makes a successful digital transformation, it requires generally technological change, and you have to have some tech expertise. You can only operationalize that if you have the operational expertise of accounting. And so the easiest way to do that is for your career paths to start including a little bit of rewarding career paths that take on these challenging projects like digital transformation. And when you hire if you think a few years from now, when you're hiring that leadership position, whether that's a director or a VP, the person that has done digital transformation before for accounting and is going to do it again for you going forward, it's going to be a job requirement. Just like you wouldn't hire a senior accountant today that didn't know how to use Excel. And so I think that career pathing is really helpful because once you have that experience, you have the experience of looking outside of just your own purview in your own workflow, but you also have the ability to communicate how and when that change will occur and how impactful it'll be upwards through your management chain. So yes, there's differing opinions, not just by function, but by level in each function.
Yeah. And what I like about your solution there is that you're almost taking a little bit of Chris's role at Capital One and making it scalable to, a pre-IPO or a scaling company where you don't necessarily need to put in a very high level business leader on technology transformation if you're in a small organization, but you can put a leader in place that is a champion in this realm that has experience here to help really bridge gaps between those perception issues. So instead of looking at your traditional roles and say, well, I have my staff accountants, I have my senior accountants, I have my managers, my controller, my financial reporting, my treasury, whatever it is, procure to pay, look at other atypical jobs such as like maybe a transformation expert on your team and blending that in. So be creative with it and realize that, obviously Capital One was able to be successful with this. So you can take and scale this and probably be successful in your organization as well. Chris, when you look at this and you look at identifying in your role and defining ROI on transformation projects at Capital One, or when you're talking to CFOs as your role in AWS, how are you bridging this gap of what is a perceived difference in, concerns or susceptibility.
Yeah, I remember when when I first became an executive, they hand you a book, at least where I was last, and the book is "What got you here won't keep you here." So it was an element of pivoting, and I think one of the things that Razak just mentioned is you've got to get this direct involvement of the end users and of the analyst community and accountant, junior accounting community, because the more you evolve your career and where you spend time and see the need for transformation, but you also need to win the hearts and minds of those who are doing the work in that regard. And one of the big gaps I see in most customers for AWS that I talk to now is they don't reserve a lot of capacity for people to focus on transformation. So they want people to transform, but they all are kind of filled to the brim with what's needed. There's demands from multiple constituents, both within accounting and finance. And it's really challenging. Some people will find creative ways to do that, either through automation and create capacity. But I think one piece of advice I would give to the audience is really think about inside of your organization, how are you creating capacity and really an incentive structure around people to transform? I know for me, there's a bunch of strategies that I would think about. One is, how do I kind of engage the end users in this regard and almost invite and set the expectations as a senior leader around what good looks like, what you want the future to be, and give them the tools and capacity to get there. So I think that's one approach. Another approach I see with a lot of companies is, and I see this within IT, is using agile-like principles in driving the work they do. I know a lot of times when you're pre-IPO or if you're in startup phase, you actually don't have a lot of resourcing. One of I was reading an article recently, and they call the CFO of a pre-IPO company the CEO, the chief of everything else, picking up operations, people, all these things. So these roles are really filled with limited capacity and limited team capacity. But that's where partners, I think, can play a big role. That's something I asked a lot. And leveraging software and providers like Flowcast is a good example around how do you get scale and use your resources for what's necessary, especially if you're expecting them to transform. And I think that goes a long way. So using agile principles, thinking about quick timelines, clear prioritization, clear backlogs, setting capacity aside to transform and making sure you're getting the progress that you're expecting. I think those are some positive patterns I see inside of organizations in helping to drive this transformation.
I love you talking about setting time aside. I think I've seen a lot of companies that no one wants to do it because it seems like a tough project. And so you end up putting your weakest performers on it. And we can all imagine how that goes. But setting time aside for your top performers to get it done is really important.
Is that why they always have me on these projects? Interesting, Razak. Well, I really like that both of you call that out of creating bench strength, essentially, right? Like you can't have a fully at capacity team if you want to drive change. You need to have room for change. You need to create a safe space for that, and part of that is people having the time and resources and authority to act on that. And anecdotally from my experience, that is something that is hit and miss. You definitely see a lot more velocity around change when those three things are behind it and aligned. Obviously there's other parts of that recipe for making it successful, but I think that's a great place. I think that is foundationally where you need to start. Moving into kind of this, what I call kind of this like failed vision of the future state that we found in the survey is based on survey responses. We kind of developed this financial transformation framework through the study. That being said, we kind of identified 4 areas of transformation that organizations talked about quite a bit. The first one being kind of like lowest on the totem pole is automated processes. So that is something that, people are generally starting there. That's the first step that you need to do. Then they move from automating that process into trying to centralize that data. Once you have centralized data, they're trying to create intelligent information from it. And then the final state of transformation, and you don't really have true transformation until you get there, is what business applications are you making off that information, right? So it's great that you have the information, but if you're not acting on it, then why'd you create it in the first place, right? Why'd you chase after that in the first place? And what we found in the study is that companies tend to have a focus on 1 or 2 aspects of that transformation and not maybe a focus on all 4. Now, obviously, some would have a higher focus depending on where you are in your transformation journey than others. But it kind of shows that like maybe some of the reason these companies are failing in transformation is this lack of a future vision or this lack of a future state. So with that, do either of you have any stories on, successfully identifying and implementing this future state? Like, how do people, avoid that pitfall of being like, oh, I'm just too focused on trying to get centralized data, or I'm just too focused on automating processes and make sure that it links up into that true business application decision making downstream?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on it, Razak. I can start. It's funny as I think about a success profile. I'll share that in a minute. But as I think of a failed element of this as well, I think there's too many times a lot of customers get stuck in trying to build and centralize that single version of truth of data. They're looking for this beautiful either data lake or whatever it may be of a central data warehouse that looks to have all the answers, and it's so tightly controlled. I've seen a lot of organizations, excuse me, struggle with trying to make that the mecca in terms of the data ecosystem. In terms of success, in terms of all the dimensions you mentioned on the transformation framework, I think what I've seen work best is having kind of a phased approach and almost leveraging kind of pilot programs to get there. This notion that it's going to be a big bang approach, the old waterfall style of delivery, it tends to not work well. So I think thinking of incremental phased elements, clear deliverables and timelines, clear way you're going to measure value and success in going through this, and then really piloting that and scaling that out. That's the pattern I've seen, given this framework, that I've seen be successful with customers. Some of this is around expectation setting of what does the end state look like. But there's also an incremental element that I think is important to bite-size these out to ensure that there's success in delivery, so that you're celebrating wins along the way. You're maintaining momentum in an organization going through it. But you're also, one thing positive I've seen, even though it may sound negative, is using constraints as a way to drive action. Usually constraints, I know we talked a little bit around not having capacity, but thinking about time, thinking about money, that could be budget. But I've seen a lot of companies be successful that it's a good blend of incremental iterative approach, but also clear constraints to force trade-offs in order to deliver on the framework that you've outlined.
I really like that. I like the idea of leveraging constraints, because it's kind of like, it makes decisions a lot easier if you have a limit here. This is the budget and you can't go over it. Well, then that tool's just off the table, right? You don't need to pass go, do any other analysis. It makes it a lot easier to then move on to other decisions. So that's a really interesting perspective I haven't heard from before. Razak, I'm sure you have had a ton of stories on this with your career. How are you dealing with keeping your eye on the prize?
I think Chris nailed it. I absolutely love his example of everybody thinks there's like a beautiful data lake of all perfect information out there, and they don't realize the cost of that. And I'm not just talking the cost of setting it up, or even the cost of storing data for every single variable of every single metric and dimension that you have in your company, but even the people cost of maintaining that. You can have the data there, but now do you have to quadruple your sales ops team because you just added a whole bunch of data they have to track? Was it actually cheaper in some ways to make those trade-offs and say, nope, I'm good with this data to this level? And I think that's also one of the reasons why so many people end up going to the CFO to help make some of these decisions on digital transformation, to help them decide what is good enough and what is just wasteful investment on it. And so there's a whole lot of benefits, kind of like going and buying a car. Hey, this $40,000 car is exactly what I need. And then you get in the process of buying the car, or in the process of digital transformation. Yeah, I'll take that option. I'll take that option. I'll take that. And all of a sudden you got a $95,000 car. And it's a whole lot of stuff you didn't need. So I think the budget or time or whatever, however you want to frame the constraints of what actually will drive value is really helpful in these processes.
I like the car analogy, because I'm much more the guy that's I buy the car and then I'm gonna drive in it until it blows up with me in it, probably. And every once in a while I'm maybe I go buy a new one, and then I look at it, I'm like, but you're free, baby. I just hop back in. Maybe that's the accountant in me, but I think it's
mine's from 2013. I've owned 3 cars in my life, so yeah, I'm with you there.
yeah, and makes you a great CFO, Razak. I like your comment on the cost of maintaining that data, but also it goes back to, it's like, whenever you look at just even doing little projects within your organization, maybe you have a user-wide event or whatever it is, you don't generally track after 15 KPIs. You might identify several that you want to report into and kind of have understanding because it tells you a richer story. But at the end of the day, you want to identify just like 2, maybe 3 KPIs that you're really driving after. Otherwise, you're gonna miss out, and you're gonna kind of make yourself too thin to execute against all of those. So just as much as that's true for little projects, it means the same thing for intelligent information and business application. If you give everybody a ton of information, they're still probably only going to use, maybe 15-20% of that. So be wise and say, what do we actually want to track and make decisions off of, and not try to just give them everything in the world when it comes to big data. Kind of building off of this, one of the things that I've seen in my career is transformations, even if they're meant to be financial transformations, do require input from other stakeholders within the organization, different departments within the organization. And a lot of times, you get this initiative, even maybe the CFO gets behind it, but then maybe once you involve sales operations, maybe once you involve IT, whoever it is cross-functionally, all of a sudden it gets stonewalled by this other leader, and we lose a lot of momentum behind it. So, Razak, in your career, how have you worked with these other departments? Like, what options are there out there for people to kind of get that cross-function communication and execution going?
Yeah, I think there's when you think about digital transformation, everybody approaches it slightly differently. Some do nothing, so I guess that's a valuable option, although I wouldn't recommend it. A lot of people try to do it within their silos, and you often get very disparate systems that way. So, hey, let's just optimize everything within AP, within the AP team, and let's optimize everything in procurement over here, and let's optimize sales ops over here. And so you actually don't get the true value, but that's not a great option either. I think that's what people are trying to avoid. The two options that I think are pretty common that everybody looks at is either creating a cross-functional project where, as Chris was saying, like people carve out 20% of their time to do it. I think that that's probably the one I lean towards most. I think it's really good. The problem is, as you said, like a lot of times that will get deprioritized within someone's workload. If it's 20% of your workload, and let's say you're FP&A, and the things that are going to be most important is hitting your quarterly guidance, making sure your business partners can hit their quarterly targets, your digital transformation probably comes in third on that list. So that's the downside. The upside is you can often get your best people on it. You can, it's the people that are actually doing the work. So they're the subject matter experts in it. And so there's a lot of that. The risk is momentum. And then the other piece is that you have kind of dedicated teams that they come out of their job and they spend 100% of their time focused on these different transformations. And I find that's great for the C-level, in that you have someone whose entire priority is that project, and you meet with them every week and you feel like there's momentum. And when they get roadblocked, they will come to you immediately and say, go unblock this for me, which is really helpful. Tons of accountability. They know it's on them. The tough part is sometimes they're herding cats a little bit. They're not necessarily the subject matter experts a lot of times, depends on how you structured it. And very few people don't always want that to be 100% of their job going forward. So you have a constant rotation of people in and out of this tiger team. Okay, I did that for a year, but now I'm going back to my normal career path. So those are the two ways, and I think both are very viable. And I think the larger of an organization you get, I've seen more likely to go with kind of that tiger team to really get it done, just because it gets so much harder to have momentum, and you can have that tiger team go right up to C-level visibility to unblock things. But for our stage of Flowcast, it's more the 20% shared time piece.
Yeah, I think that's some great perspective, that there's pros and cons to the different options on how you execute. And there are options. So when you're looking at that transformation, selecting the one that maybe most appropriately fits what your needs and goals are. Chris, obviously have done a lot of this. I think there's a question here, and also when do you bring in that stakeholder, right? Like, what's the appropriate time or times that you need to include them?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on this. First, and Razak may not say this, but finance teams have a lot of influence inside the company, and sometimes they don't want to leverage it. But this is a perfect time for me. Where I would leverage it is finance are small and mighty teams, generally finance and accounting, but their influence is much greater. So I think money is a big incentive in doing this. So CFOs can make things happen inside of your company in terms of where money gets allocated and where it goes, so it can help you out. And make that a residual kind of win-win for both an IT team that may be struggling with resourcing, but let's get a win, and you can amplify that win as a way in which they're driving value in the business. So, I always love to use the CFO's role to help influence money and incentives in the company. So that's one approach. The other is there's two mechanisms specifically within Amazon that I've been exposed to. There's this concept of a single-threaded leader. So, who is the individual who is 100% accountable for an outcome? So this notion of clear accountability sometimes gets blurred in companies because it feels like multiple people are accountable, or you never define who's truly accountable, so that that stakeholders can get confused in that regard. But this is also a culture where escalation is positively viewed versus negatively viewed. I know in most companies I engage with, you do anything to not have an escalation. You would do anything to not shine a light on something that may be challenging. In Amazon, it's very different. It's kind of, the incentive is to escalate quickly so that the right decisions could be made. So as I think about a potential stonewalling of a transformation activity, in the end, you need to get the facts together, have the right information together, and then escalate or elevate for a trade-off to be made. And it could go either way. It could be this isn't as big of a priority relative to other work that IT or sales ops or others are doing, or nobody was ever presented with all the information to make that trade-off. So I would think about those two mechanisms, clear accountability, single-threaded leader, as well as escalation, as a way to shine a light on when some of the stonewalling occurs, but also being comfortable that whatever the outcomes are, leaning behind those outcomes and moving forward versus still trying to find creative ways to get there if it's truly not a priority for the organization.
I really like that idea of changing the culture around escalation, right? Making it to where people aren't going to be fearful of hiding, flaws or issues, and say, hey, like, this is what's going on, so that there's good communication along the way. Something that Razak has told me in the past that I really like is, like, you can't always go to the CFO with bad news. You got to make sure that you have some good news along the way. But I think it is good for everybody to say, hey, like, make sure that information is communicated in a timely manner, that it's okay, so that people can prioritize correctly and not be working under false assumptions. And I really like that, just shifting the culture around that could drive a lot of success there. So I think that's a great way to kind of look at solving that problem. One thing I want to talk about really quickly, because we mentioned the survey, but I don't want to go into too much detail about it, is AI's impact. So in the survey, we see that about a third of CFOs and accountants see AI as being a critical component to financial transformation, and about a third are enthusiastic about AI and how it'll play an important role for accounting and finance going forward. How do you guys see AI really impacting transformation, whether that's demand of transformation, goals of transformation, or even the success of transformation as you see it today? Chris, I'll start with you. I feel like you probably have quite a few of these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and there's this interesting dynamic. I know when I talk to customers of people who've leveraged Gen AI in their personal lives versus Gen AI within the workplace. I know I've got multiple children, so how are children using it within school or not using it within school? How people are just having fun with it in their personal lives, but how you then could apply it to help solve problems. So I think I definitely agree with you on the transformation demand. I think there's, especially in finance and accounting, there tends to be a lot of pressure for continued efficiency, continued productivity, and this notion of, in quotes, do more with less kind of mentality that's kind of ingrained in a lot of CFOs' minds. They want to be good stewards of the capital of the company. They also want to be an example inside of their organization of running a well-run team and well-run shop. That I think there's a pressure there. So, and I do believe some of the promises of Gen AI could enable a lot of productivity. And we see that a lot specifically in the developer community. If you think about this from a coding companion standpoint, I know a lot of finance teams will use SQL or Python to support forecasting or data analysis. This can help someone specifically who maybe isn't super proficient in Python or SQL to get things started and use it as a jumping off point. So I definitely agree with the demand one. I think on the goals side and success side, I think we're all kind of striving for not only accuracy of what we do, but also great experiences for those around us in terms of our customers. So I totally agree around some of this, but I think there's also a lot of naysayer kind of, if you read about AI out there, I think I remember the quote, it was something like a third of finance and accounting jobs will be displaced with AI. I'm not sure that's true from my personal vantage point. I think AI is more of a tool versus a replacement. It's an enabler, and you get much more productive, especially as it continues to get more accurate through time as new LLMs and models come out. I think it's intended to be a complement to what you do in an enabler for driving efficiency versus a replacement of activities, at least from my viewpoint.
I think that's great. And that really actually goes into the other question I had on AI that I'll pass over to Razak, which is, a lot of people are skeptical still of AI. It's like a third are very, enthusiastic about it, but that also leaves a large population that is maybe scratching their head or not enthusiastic about it. So, Gartner has their hype cycle. I think the technical term is actually Moore's law, where people kind of see this like big, peak of peak of the hype cycle, and then they wait for the other shoe to drop as it enters the state of disillusionment before it hits this productive plateau or whatever they call it. There's everybody has a take on this. So Razak, do you see this as true? Do you see a different future when it comes to AI in this space, looking at maybe practical application, et cetera?
Yeah, I think Chris nailed it on the head in that it's going to make everyone's lives a little easier and more productive. And whether that is, we have a lot of customers and we use it internally to speed up workflows, to do a lot of the part of the workflow that maybe can be very valuable, but doesn't have to be on its own. An example, checking data, unstructured data, making sure it fits, making sure it's ready for a senior analyst to actually interpret and put into the system. I think Chris mentioned earlier as well about how important explainability was for FP&A teams. And I think that's true for AI in general. The black box is fine when it works, but when it doesn't work, a black box isn't it. And so the AI is going to have to get better and better at explainability and documentation of how it came up with answers. But, zooming out, it's a tool that's here to stay. It's, we can talk about how impactful it's going to be, what percentage, what year, all those things, but it's a tool that's here to stay. You wouldn't hire someone that doesn't know how to use Excel today. And I think in the future, you're not going to hire somebody who doesn't know tech transformations and how to leverage the modern tools. AI will be one of them. I guess I would just say people do need to change in some ways how they think about AI. It's not so much, a lot of the power that people are seeing in AI is not so much just replicating exactly what they do and that piece. It's also a very creative tool, and it can help you find things that are not part of your standard workflows, whether that be checking for entries that don't make sense or for fraud or for other things. There's a whole lot of creative use cases. So instead of thinking of AI like Excel, even though I just made that comparison where 1 + 1 = 2, thinking about how you can use AI to solve problems that you weren't solving before just because it was too much data and too much complexity and took too much time to sort through for a giant team of people. Can you do some things that you couldn't do before with AI?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way for people to look at it and remind themselves of the practicality of any tool that they're using, and that this is here to stay. Companies are adopting it at a rapid pace. About a third of companies are probably using it today, and not just looking to adopt it, but are actively adopting it within their organizations. So it has a momentum. So instead of worrying about, what it can or can't do in the future, just look at, hey, let's be practical, let's adopt it, and, kind of ride the wave of change as it goes forward. And I also like the idea of just looking at it not in the same way you look at maybe a human. People look at, well, it's artificial intelligence going to replace the human element. It's like, well, no, there's 1,000 different ways you can use the tool to help you with things. And a great example is flux analysis, where it can help and kind of give you a draft of what the flux analysis might be for a particular financial statement line item account, right? Not that your team can't do that, but it kind of overcomes that blank slate syndrome where people are like, oh, now I got to go do all this research. Well, it did half of it. Now you maybe have to go in and validate a little of it. You want to make sure that what it's saying is correct, but you are already kind of starting, 20% across the journey instead of at zero, which can be incredibly helpful for people. The last thing I'm going to move into on the study is transparency and execution. This was kind of the last part of the study that we were looking at. And the study found that CFOs, that financial transformation initiatives that have financial transformation initiatives are far more likely to exist if the CFO feels susceptible, has concerns for, and sees potential barriers for the issues. And accountants show a little less difference there. So the idea is that at face value, if your CFO doesn't feel susceptibility to the point where they actually have prioritized concerns around it and then actually see a way to solve that problem, it's less likely that they're going to have some aspect of an initiative or transformation around that issue. So one, I guess my question is, do you agree with those factors? And then two, how are you going about identifying, what you're susceptible to? How are you increasing your level of concern to a prioritization of needing a transformation around it? And so, Razak, I'll start with you. In your experience, what is helping you identify what needs that transformation behind it?
Yeah, I hope that would be the results of the study. The things that get C-level visibility and the problems being discussed at C-level are most likely to get solved across the company. If that's not the case, that's concerning. So definitely, the bigger the problem, the higher visibility level, the more likely it is to get solved. I think for getting to these things, this is where I talked earlier about having a strong team, and really the management, the directors, the VPs have to be able to understand the roles, understand where data and processes and workflows are breaking, and be able to understand if there's actually a solution to that, and is the technical solution better than just manually going through it. And those leaders that can understand both the individual contributor, person doing the work, and what their job looks like and how it impacts other teams across the company and how to solve it, are the ones that are going to communicate upward effectively and get that on the C-level's radar so that it gets solved.
And I think that's something that kind of leads into my final question here that I'll tee up for Chris, which is this idea of like feeding the beast. So the beast being that transformation isn't occurring within the organization. When we look at this, and I can say, anecdotally again from my career, there is this this line you have to walk to say, okay, how do I communicate something and prioritize something for the CFO without, to Chris's point earlier, raising the alarm on exceptions or concerns or issues. So, a lot of companies, as you said, Chris, look at, raising the alarm on things in a negative way. It makes it seem like you are maybe perhaps incapable of your job or incapable of doing the work. Whereas as Amazon, they've kind of flipped the script culturally to say, no, we want you to help us prioritize things appropriately. How is that line walked at Amazon for people to find that line of not feeding the beast and preventing and putting blinders on the CFO? So for instance, I will work later, I will work harder, so will my team, so that it isn't an issue for the CFO. It doesn't seem like we're unable to hit maybe days to close or financial accuracy or whatever the issue is. And in which case, as a CFO, if there's nothing going wrong KPIs, and obviously you don't think there's an issue, how do you flip the script to healthily have that culture of accepting the alarm, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts on that. One, I think an element of an open, trusted dynamic within the relationships and partners you have at work matter. So I think creating that environment to succeed and be open around what that means. I think in the end, most CFOs and accountants want to make data-driven decisions. So I think what could be helpful in these kind of circumstances is how do you elevate and maybe you think, I always think of, I don't know why I've been exposed to it a lot, like 2x2 matrices. Like how do I put and plot an assessment of what's my level of concern? Maybe what's the size of the impact if something were to occur, or the size of the issue? because there's always this element of you manage what you measure kind of dynamic that's in the back of a lot of CFOs' minds. So I think thinking through both leading and lagging indicators around some of the element of need for transformation. So it could be attrition rate of the talent within your team. It could be the attrition rate of we call non-regrettable attrition, like people you didn't want to leave or leaving. It could be element of like an NPS element, net promoter score, like how satisfied are you with your job? I know a lot of companies use internal survey data to do that, but I think using data to drive the decision, it helps it to communicate it in a much easier way of what's the framework leverage. But two, sometimes the data will say something different than the anecdotes. And you need to find a balance between both listening to people, but also what are the opportunities in front of you. So I think there's a ton of opportunity in this space around understanding needs and finding something Razak mentioned earlier around this like cross-functional teams, getting different perspectives, diverse perspectives to mind, and then ultimately just having a mechanism or process to make decisions around this. And one of the ways Amazon does this is they try to reduce dependencies. If anybody's read about Amazon, there's a quote out there that communication is viewed as a failure because there's a desire to kind of isolate teams to be insulated from others and make decisions that are necessary for themselves. And sometimes the other thing is 2 is better than 1 is another thing, which is if we're solving customers' needs and delivering that, even if there's a little overlap, it's still a better outcome for the customer than isolating that. I think not all companies operate like Amazon does. So I think that's a reality of the situation. In some companies, especially where they have smaller finance or accounting teams, they can get into a bigger pinch point because there's a lot of key person dependencies around a lot of these processes and outcomes. So succession planning, basic documentation of desktop procedures, things that people generally don't want to do. That's where Gen AI and some other things can help a lot, which is almost, you can almost have a recording element of the activities you do and have the technology kind of document and what's necessary. So how do you leverage technology as an enabler and get scale in some of these instances could be a big unlock for understanding those needs and reducing dependencies on some individuals on manual processing. So there's all kinds of ways in this regard. But I think the big key for me in all of this, as you've heard this, is one, how do you get inspired about what the art of the possible is? How do you create capacity within your team to allow them some headway to transform? But then how do you make sure that you're celebrating, incentivizing the right behaviors you're looking for as you go through a transformation?
I think that's one excellent tie back to the earlier question of AI. Well done. And two, also just, what I like about the solution that you put in front, and Razak, you were hinting at this with your response as well, is, there's feeding the beast. So this obvious solution is to starve the beast. And that's not a healthy way to go about this. The better way to go about this is just to use data and information to communicate to the stakeholders when there is a need, and making sure that, one, you've built the trust, but then two, substantiate it, put ROI behind it, do the analysis as best you can. If you're struggling, ask, but say, hey, this is where I'm struggling. How can I document this? Or maybe what are some stats we could look at? And that might be working cross-functionally within your department as well, where as a controller, maybe I don't have certain information on NPS score or something like that. Okay, well, that means reach out to HR, whoever your business unit, support system is there, and say, hey, can you help me understand how my team feels about the technology they use? Or maybe in the next survey, we can include that. I'm hearing some grumblings, but put some data behind it. And that way, when you go to communicate that, it's a much more structured, informative information. And that will help the CFO then understand not that just that they're susceptible, but also how to prioritize that and get it to an appropriate level of concern, and not just lead them and say, well, hey, here's this issue that you need to help solve for me type thing. Because as Razak said, you can't go to the CFO with bad information, like with issues all the time. Work with the CFO. And that's where I guess my advice to controllers is, listen, if you're listening to this, take a lot of what they're saying here and say, okay, how do I become a better support to my CFO? Take this advice to heart. With that, I'd really like to thank the listeners for joining us on this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. Thank you so much. If you want to hear more or learn more about this, please download our financial transformation survey. It's called Embracing Financial Transformation: What it is, why an organization should want it, and how to achieve it. It is excellently written. Dee Wormuth at University of Georgia helped us do the survey. She is fantastic. She always gives us great insights. So please go ahead and download it. If you want other news and information, we have our virtual user and company-wide event coming up called Take Control, where we go over not just what's going on with our product, but a lot of thought leadership around AI, a lot of thought leadership just about the accounting profession in general and what's changing. So a lot of good information there. Join us. It's September 25th and 26th. You can go to our homepage and register there. I would like to thank our crew, John Siegel and Kobe. These guys are working behind the scenes to make sure that these podcasts get out. It is a lot of work. Our Flowcast Studios teams, it's a lot of work. So huge shout out to them. And then always super special thank you to Razak. You're always super helpful at this organization, not only from a CFO leadership perspective, but also on the thought leadership stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. And Chris Hennessy with AWS, thank you for providing all of your background and all your information here. Both of you, this was super insightful to me. I hope that anybody that was listening found it equally insightful. And come join us for our next episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. Thank you, everybody.